Black Cooperatives, Localization. We have an incredible panel of speakers. We're going to go ahead and get started now. If the noise from outside gets to be too much, please let me know and we'll close the door. But it might get to be a bit... I asked once, could you reinforce my request? Thank you.
As long as you keep this fan system off. That's the downside of it. Remember that in your room yesterday?
Yes, we had shout.
So I want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time to come to this panel discussion. We're going to start this morning with a keynote from David Sweikert, and I keep having to double check my pronunciation of his name. And David is a professor of philosophy at Loyola University in Chicago, and he was formerly, he says long ago, a professor of mathematics at the University of Kentucky, and author of Against Capitalism from Cambridge Press, and most recently After Capitalism. He has written numerous articles, some of which have been translated into Chinese, Spanish, French, and Farsi. He sent me a note. I was the lead organizer, the staff organizer for the United States Social Forum in Atlanta last summer, and I do have information on it for those who are interested. And David was there. He participated in a series of workshops on alternative economics, where he debated Michael Albert about alternatives to capitalism. And today he's going to talk to you about some thoughts on localization and the transition to economic democracy. And you help me to welcome David Sweikert.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to talk about two books today. Actually, when I was invited to this conference, I knew nothing about Prout, and so I thought I'd better find out something about it. And I assumed that everyone here would know about Prout, but that may be a false assumption. In any event, it turned out that I had on my bookshelf a book that, interestingly enough, had the same title as my own book, and it came out a year after. So I'm going to talk about both of those books, both called After Capitalism. That one's mine. It's got Marx on the cover, and this is also called After Capitalism. It is subtitled Prout's Vision for a New World by Dharma Harishvarananda. I picked that up earlier. It has a preface by Noam Chomsky. It's endorsed on the back by Howard Zinn and by the liberation theologian Leonardo Boff. So I thought, I better look at this, you know. And so when I was invited to speak here, I thought I better read it and then compare it, you know, with my own work. I was kind of amazed by the overlap, okay. It turns out that in both books, both are anti-capitalist, both are critical of centrally planned, non-market socialism, the model of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and so on. Both advocate, and we use exactly the same term, economic democracy for an alternative economic structure. Both see cooperatives and worker self-managed enterprises as the major form of business organization. I mean, and this is kind of amazing. I mean, I'm sure he's never read my stuff, I've never read his, and we're coming up with, you know, exactly the same things. Both allow for small-scale private enterprise. Both advocate a decentralized market economy. Both stress the importance of full employment, meaning a decent job for everyone. Both allow for inter-firm market competition and also for a degree of inequality within firms to provide, you know, the appropriate incentives. So, as I say, I was amazed in reading this book, the degree to which we agree. So, what are the differences? Well, the Prout Vision for a New World, you know, that's the subtitle of this book, in some sense is a larger vision than what I articulate in my book. I've been obsessed from my graduate student days in the economic structures of an alternative to capitalism. I mean, I had read Marx, and I'm paying tribute to Marx with the cover of the book here, and I found Marx's critique of capitalism on target, devastating, but then the question is, well, but what is the alternative? How could you have a viable alternative? And I was reading The Economist, and there's the sense out there, well, there isn't any alternative. Capitalism, you know, is the best we can do in an imperfect world, and so on and so forth. And I don't believe that, and my research has led me to the conclusion that that's not true, that we can actually envisage clear alternative, to capitalism, and we can specify what those structures might be. Okay. Now, Prout does that also, not as technically concerned as I am, but he's got a larger vision that involves a spiritual component, for example. I mean, there's going to be a chapter on spirituality and meditation. There's a concern about the forming of the individual. There's an interesting chapter in the Prout book on sustainable agriculture. Now, I don't write about agriculture myself, but I agree. I think that's an enormously important topic. I mean, when you realize that over half of the world's poor live in rural areas, the question of agriculture, is vital. And so I'm really happy to see that addressed. The Prout talks about education. I don't talk about that. Talks about world government. I don't talk about that. And they spend a lot of time, talking about localization, which is the theme, that I'm supposed to talk about here. And I really don't talk much about that, in my own book. I do have a different take, a difference with, the model articulated here on a couple of elements. One has to do, and I'll come back to those, with regional investment strategies and the transition question. How are we going to get, from where we are now to here? But let me say a few words about localization. I am deeply sympathetic to this notion of localization, the idea of local production and regional self-sufficiency. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, the pressing one we're feeling right now is the environmental reasons. There is something environmentally bizarre about transporting food halfway around the planet using all of the resources and energy and so on when localities can grow their own food. I mean, maybe it won't be quite the same food, but you can grow healthy, sustainable food, locally. And just generally the huge transport costs that are involved now in transporting things around the world. It would be much better if production were closer to where consumption takes place. I think that's right. Also, I think the notion of community stability is important. I think when communities are the whole livelihood of an area is based on one factory or one commodity or something like that, and when demand for that commodity shifts, you can see the deindustrialization. You can see once thriving communities, fall apart. So when you've got, lots of different production and you've got a mix of agriculture and industry and so on, the communities are much more stable, and I think stable communities are important. They're important psychologically. I mean, I think, people need to have a sense of rootedness and stability, and a stable community, helps provide that. Also, I think there's just something, healthy about growing up. We realize we're social beings, we're connected to other people, but when we can tangibly see it, well, those are the people that are growing the food that I'm eating, and those are the people that are making the implements that I'm using, and you can see materially, how we are connected, how we're all involved in producing what we need, but we're not all doing everything ourselves, but we can see how we're connected. So I really think, there's the notion of localization is very powerful. Now, of course, you've got to be dialectic with this idea. Mahesh talks about this too. You don't want your regionalism to degenerate into kind of a nationalist, an ethnic nationalism, because we know that is a danger. I mean, you saw it most recently. You see it right now in lots of places, ethnic conflicts all over the place. You saw Yugoslavia fall apart, because of that, for example. But on the other hand, I mean, I think ideally you want a citizen, you want a human being that feels rooted in their local community, but also at the same time seeing themselves as a citizen of the world. We are part of the human species. And I don't think it's impossible to have both. In fact, I think actually if you're rooted in a healthy, stable community and have a healthy, stable sense of identity, you are actually better able to empathize with others, to appreciate the humanity of others, and value the differences in other cultures and so on. So, I don't think there's a contradiction between localization and a concern for global humanity, and I think the movements that we're all concerned with now are worried about both. worried about local communities and psychological well-being, but we're also worried about the fate of the planet. Now, another thing that I wanted to stress, because a commonality in my book and the Prout After Capitalism is the importance of cooperatives. I make that the centerpiece of my model of economic democracy, that enterprises ought to be run democratically. When you join an enterprise, it should be like joining a community. You join, you get to vote. One person, one vote. You elect some kind of governing structure, some kind of worker council that appoints management, but your management is answerable to you, to the workers, the voters. So I, fully agree with that. I think, that not every enterprise necessarily has to be a cooperative or worker-run, but the bulk of your enterprises should be like that. There can be a role for some small businesses, private enterprise, but once you get beyond a certain size, I think we want democratic structures. Now, there's something interesting about cooperatives and localization that I hadn't really thought about before putting those two ideas together. And it's a structural reason. Economists that have studied democratic firms in comparison with capitalist firms have noticed something. They seem similar. They're both out there competing, they're producing things. I mean, why would one be any different from the other? Well, it turns out there's a very fundamental structural difference. And it has to do with the fact that a capitalist enterprise is inherently inclined to grow if it's doing well. You can think of a simple example. You set up a little hot dog stand and it does well, it makes you $20,000. Well, if you can set up another one, you can have $40,000. If you can have three, you can have $60,000. You can have a whole chain. You can keep making, because you're maximizing your total profits. But notice, if you had a worker-run hot dog stand, if you set up another one, well, there's twice as many workers. So you've got twice as much profit, but you divide it among twice as many people. Okay, if you had three of them, there'd be 3 times as many. So technically, democratic firms tend to maximize profit per worker as opposed to total profit, which means it doesn't have the same expansionary tendency. And if we're talking about local economies, you want your enterprises not to be things that have to keep growing and expanding and so on and so forth. You want, economies that will keep it pretty much a basic size, okay? And in using your technologies, another crucial difference is when you do have new technologies, instead of using your technology to produce more and expand your markets and so on, you can use the technology for more leisure. Because anytime you have a labor-saving technology, there's a choice theoretically. You can use the same amount of labor and produce more, or you can produce the same amount and work less. Capitalism is overwhelmingly biased to the first alternative. You produce more, okay? But a democratic firm, there's options here. So I think cooperatives, for structural reasons, apart from being democratic and inherently valuable for those reasons, there's an interesting structural reason why they are more appropriate to this vision of regionalism and localization. As to the differences, I'll just say a couple of quick points. Two that stand out. One has to do with raising finance, the financial structure, raising your capital for reinvestment. Now, the Prout model here wants that to be local too. Local regions raise their own investment funds and reinvest and so on. Now, ultimately that might make sense, but I think it doesn't make sense when there's a lot of divergence in the levels of development of communities. This, by the way, I think is one of the problems that Yugoslavia faced and didn't face appropriately. When individual regions are developing their own investment, the richer regions have more to reinvest, the richer regions become richer, the poorer regions tend to fall behind, and the ethnic tensions and things exacerbate that way. An alternative to that, that's what I advocate in the book here, is to say at the national level, you should collect your investment fund. You collect it by having a tax on all of your enterprises out there, a capital assets tax, a flat rate tax. Every business pays the same percent of its capital assets, and you can think of that simply as a leasing fee. You can think of the resources of society are collective, but workers are running their enterprise, they're leasing that from society. You'll pay a tax, a leasing fee. The more capital you have, the more you pay. All of that gets collected into a national investment fund and then gets put back into the economy to regions on a per capita basis, so that every region gets its fair share, its per capita share of the national investment fund. So every year, every region knows there's money coming in, earmarked for investment. It can then be democratically allocated. You can decide how much of that for starting up new businesses, how much to develop businesses that want to retool or expand or go into a different line, and how much for infrastructure. But that has the structural effect. First of all, regions don't compete for investment, and it's not the richer regions, get richer every year. Each region gets its per capita share. So that's, a technical difference from the model that's mentioned here. The other has to do with the notion of transition, of how to get from here to there. And one of the large things looming here is the corporations, the multinational, gigantic corporations. What do we do about them? Okay. And I want to suggest that the first struggle should be to democratize those corporations. And that it can actually be done. Now, there's different ways that it could be done, and that corporations could be turned over to their workers. But let me give you a dramatic scenario. Just imagine there was a huge financial collapse in the United States. Not totally unimaginable these days, right? Suppose you had, an organization, a political party that sort of had an agenda, knew what to do. Sort of think of Roosevelt and the New Deal. Okay, there's tremendous financial collapse. First thing you'd find, everybody's going to be screaming for the government to do something. All of these free enterprise people, get government off our back. Government, you got to help us out. We're in a state of collapse. Your government says, fine, nothing to fear but fear itself. Okay, we still got all our enterprises, we still got all our workers, we still got all our resources. There's no reason to panic. Okay. Now, as it's turned out, the stock market has collapsed, so these corporations' stocks are worth nothing. They're worth pennies. Okay, we'll buy them. We'll buy them for 2 or 3 times, what they're worth right now. We're not going to expropriate them. We're going to pay. We're going to buy them. Okay. All of a sudden, we own all the government owns all the corporations. Okay. Which, by the way, is what happened with the savings and loan meltdown. The government wound up owning all the savings and loan. Okay. But the government then said, well, let's sell off the good parts to the capitalists and let the taxpayers absorb the. What have we said? Oh, we've got the enterprises. Let's turn them over to the workers. Run them democratically. Keep the managers you've got if you like them, but in a year you'll have an election, and if you don't like them, and so on. Structurally, it's not hard to imagine, And since you don't have any stockholders anymore, no stock dividends, well, you'll pay a capital assets tax instead of paying stock dividends to the you bought out those people. We'll pay our capital assets tax. We've got our alternative financial structure. We don't need stock markets anymore. We don't need bond markets. We get rid of all of that. Okay. You still have the corporations. They're democratic now. Then you can think maybe of how to make the transition from there to the localized economy. And you may decide not everything can be local. You may still want certain, you're still going to need steel, you're going to need buses, you're going to need lots. But you may want to, and one of the things about a democratic corporation also is they often tend to split up into pieces, because democratically it's easier to manage something that's smaller rather than something larger. So you can break them up into pieces, but that can be done. The corporations, the democratically run corporation, can decide to do that as they see fit. So I would propose thinking of the model of economic democracy that I propose as maybe a transition, to something more in line with the localized Proutist vision. So that's my take on all this. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I didn't even have to bring out my time card on here. Oh, man, you did great. I am going to make a request. Please turn off your cell phones. They are recording, and if you have to make a phone call, please step out. I hope that you will please do that. We have 4 panelists who are going to be speaking now, and if you all forgive me, in no particular order I was given, so I'm sort of going to just go with the flow. And when I walked in the room, Carl was the first person to greet me, and for his promptness, he shall be rewarded. So I want to introduce next Carl Gunther, a writer promoting integrity, versus top-down control. You will each have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, what Professor Schweikert just said about the transition is what I'd like to explore in my presentation. And, what he presented just now is based on a conjunctural perspective in a way that there will be a crisis and, perhaps we'll be able to take control of the government and have them take control of these companies and transfer them to workers. But, I'm presenting a different, more gradualist kind of perspective on the transition here. In the market socialism model, worker cooperatives with worker ownership and democratic decision-making replace the internal hierarchy and the largely non-worker ownership of corporate businesses. Externally, as Professor Schweikert just mentioned, each worker-run business looks very much like any capitalist enterprise. The cooperative sells its goods to consumers, it buys from and sells to other businesses, with the open market largely determining the price of each item that's transferred. In the fully developed market socialist economy, in other words, in an economy where market socialism is the prevailing approach, there is a tax on capital, a system of publicly run investment banks that reinvest the social surplus in both the founding of new businesses and the expansion of existing businesses. The existence of such features in the final global implementation of this approach represents a regulatory modification of the free market aspect of market socialism that, in my opinion, is what makes the system actually capable of serving an ethical purpose. Since the theme of this conference is building a new world, what I would like to explore is the evolution of a market socialist system as it moves from a set of individual worker cooperatives that are operating within a largely capitalist system to a fully developed state in which it can implement its universal tax on capital and its reinvestment policies, and in which almost all of the other businesses with which a given cooperative will be dealing are also worker cooperatives. To survive during the transition phase, the market socialist system will have to defend itself against the many features of the surrounding capitalist system that will work against its survival. Let's first consider an individual worker cooperative under the present capitalist system. The first problem faced by a group of workers attempting to form a cooperative is the need to raise funds for the purchase of capital. Since the cooperative approach requires that the cooperative's workers also be its owners, the new cooperative must require each of its founding members to contribute equal shares of funds toward capital acquisition. Unlike a corporation, the cooperative will not have access to the capital markets, as outside ownership would conflict with the main reason for the system to exist, worker self-management. This would seem to limit the worker-run cooperative to either an elite group of workers with much larger than average financial resources or to running a business that requires very little capital. Any outside financing would have to be awarded to the individual workers as individuals on their individual merits rather than based upon their collective business plan, since the individual workers are to be the owners of the business. The number of cooperatives that can be founded based upon individual worker financing is obviously limited, especially with the very low levels of average savings found in the U.S. today. This leaves the option of running a business without very much capital, which means a business whose main component is labor. One of the consequences of running a labor-intensive business is that the business would tend to compete fairly directly with the pool of individual laborers who are already under a severe disadvantage in the present system. The need to compete with this group of exploited laborers would pressure the workers of the business to lower their own wages in order to compete more effectively. Capital requirements aside, the new cooperative would be competing in an environment dominated by largely capitalist businesses that have no scruples regarding their looting of the environment and the underpaying of their workers. These capitalist businesses would also be able to source their materials from other nations in which worker rights are even more disrespected than they are here. This would pressure the worker cooperative to engage in similar practices in order to compete. Since the wages of the workers in a pure market socialist cooperative would depend upon the profits of the business, this could ultimately result in some combination of unethical business practices and lowered wages. What this illustrates is that the worker cooperative, although democratically governed and owned, would nonetheless be pressured to take on many of the characteristics of exploitative capitalist businesses in its surrounding environment due to the competitive pressures which affect it through its participation in the free market. Another thing that it points out is that while the democratic ownership of a business by its workers is an ethically superior approach required by the market socialist model, ethical practices by such worker-run businesses are not an inherent part of the market socialist model per se. Despite the fact that the model per se does not require such ethical practices, I am presuming that part of our purpose in pursuing this model would be to make such ethical, sustainable practices prevalent within the entire economy. In order to do that, we will have to place ethical requirements upon our worker-run businesses that go beyond market socialism per se. These requirements would eventually translate, once market socialism becomes the prevailing model, into governmental practices such as tariffs, labor laws, environmental regulations, etc. But at the intermediate stages between isolated worker cooperatives and overall market socialism, we would need organizations that bind the various worker-run cooperatives together into a coherent entity through some kind of a franchising process that can not only implement and enforce such ethically desired policies, but which can also confer a competitive advantage to the group of evolving and growing worker-run cooperatives that makes it possible for them to survive as a group within the toxic surrounding capitalist environment. By franchising, I mean that there would be a group of cooperatives to which a worker cooperative could gain entry by agreeing to a certain set of conditions. The group would then make certain advantages, such as access to a common bank that provides funding for new cooperatives and for the expansion of existing cooperatives, available on an exclusive basis to its members. Such a bank could also finance an individual worker's share of a cooperative business that must be purchased when the worker starts employment with that business. Cooperatives within the network would also trade with one another on a preferential basis as part of their ethical commitment to sourcing from companies that respect labor and the environment. In doing this, we would be evolving not just a growing aggregate of worker-run businesses, but also an embryo, the ethical, regulatory policies and processes that would eventually be implemented throughout the entire economy. What I'm describing here is a form of solidarity between worker-run businesses that have made a certain ethical commitment that insulates those businesses from the capitalist-dominated free marketplace that would otherwise either corrupt or destroy them. The free market component of market socialism would be preserved, but only within that evolving network of businesses. Trade outside of the network would be performed as needed on a non-preferred basis until the network gradually became more self-sustaining, in the course of expanding to the point of becoming the prevailing paradigm, at which point there would be no further need for an inside versus outside dichotomy. The centralized institutions involved in this are the cooperative banks and the meta-organization that oversees the franchising process. These are analogous to the government-run banks and regulatory enforcement agencies of the final market socialist economy proposed in the market socialist model. To the extent that there is a strong bottom-up representative democratic process involved in electing the members of such meta-institutions with an active involvement in creating their policies, there should not significantly challenge localization of specific decisions that are made at the level of the worker cooperative. But I might add that in the market socialist model presented by Professor Schweikert, I believe that the control of investment is done by a central government that really isn't mediated through the worker cooperatives. And in this system that I'm suggesting, this modification, the worker cooperatives actually have a bottom-up influence on the making of economic policy. So they're intimately involved in the making of economic policy at their local levels and then cascading upward through a representative process. To get this fire started, we will have to consume our tinder. Our tinder is workers and consumers who already have an ethical commitment to sustainability. For example, fair trade relies upon consumers who are both ethically motivated and economically successful enough within the capitalist economy to be able to turn down the cheaper products made by businesses that exploit labor and the environment. This is an extremely limited group. Just like the tinder, when you start a fire, it's going to be gone quickly. And when it's gone, we have to include the hitherto unwashed in order to expand our model further. To accomplish this without abandoning our ethical commitments, we will have to reproduce an ethical worldview within each cooperative business that joins our franchise. This requires training in the ethos of the cooperative group, which will become part of the franchising process. Part of this would be to instill a cultural solidarity, something that the Mondragon Cooperative does more or less through its schools, which propagate the local Basque culture. There will have to be similar outreach to consumers through consumer cooperatives that provide ethical training for their members. To address the problems of competing with unethical capitalist businesses, we need to look for advantages that accrue to worker-run cooperatives that do not accrue to such capitalist businesses. One such advantage is the internal democracy of worker-run businesses, which encourages worker creativity and innovation. To ensure that we attain that advantage, we will have to take action to prevent de facto hierarchies from evolving due to the skills involved, the work complexes. Unbalanced work complexes also subject the cooperative to another form of competition within the capitalist marketplace, the search for skilled labor to fill technical management positions. Now, I know there's been a debate between Professor Schweikert and Michael Albert on the issue of work complexes, and I think the points that the professor has made regarding the difficulties in implementing the balanced work complexes proposed by Albert are very real and very good criticisms. But nonetheless, if we don't have balanced work complexes, somehow we're going to have these hierarchies that evolve as a result of the distribution of labor, where some people have more empowering work that gives them more control over the enterprise.
Well, thank you very much for your
I'm
presentation.
done. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry I have to run a tight ship. We have a couple of complications today. Some of you may have noticed that the cafeteria actually will be closing at 1 o'clock today, so that this workshop ends at 12:45. Ngora has made a suggestion, and I, believing in democracy, leave it up to you whether you wish to take that suggestion. She is suggesting that we stop this workshop at 12 o'clock, allow people to go eat, and then reconvene at 1. And I do want to put that to you if that is something that you would like to do. And of course, we have to have consensus in order for it to work.
Many of us didn't get breakfast either.
Many of you didn't get panelists, is that,
First feed the face, then
is that
judge
okay
right
with
and
you?
wrong.
Okay, in that case, we have time for 2 more presentations. Maybe, if we can stay on time, maybe only 1, and then we would come back afterwards, complete the presentations, and then take questions. And I do hope you all will return at 1 o'clock for the rest of the presentations. Thank you very much for participating in that little bit of democracy. I want to introduce now Ronald Logan. And Ronald Logan is the author of Prout, A New Paradigm of Development, and is the Associate Director of the Prout Institute.
I left the excellent panel this morning on the fight for economic democracy early so I could scramble over to the cafeteria and get a little bit of food before getting over here. Anyway, I'm going to go with the majority vote here. One other thing is, my wife gave me a cell phone before I left. I'm such a novice with these, I don't even know how to turn it off, so Alice might ring on me.
Just don't answer.
I'm one of these speakers, when given a topic, you know, I just look at it very literally and try to grasp what the essence of it is and speak to that. And I had prepared remarks in the subject of why cooperatives, just going into the compelling reasons why cooperatives are superior enterprises, much of which was covered very nicely by David. But unlike other panels I've been to here at this program, in which there's a topic and then speakers tend to go off in their own realms with it, David started off really kind of evoking a dialogue, and Carl's comments stayed quite close to the point as well. And I thought I might throw aside most of what I had prepared and try and speak a bit extemporaneously and see whether I could continue with this. I will say that one thing about why cooperatives, if I could just encapsulate this quickly, I had the good fortune to work a little bit with Jaroslav Vanik. Did you ever know him? Yeah. He was probably the world's leading authority on the economics of worker-managed economies. A passionate advocate, lifelong advocate for cooperative economies, unlike many that Ian talked about earlier today, who are, what was your hummingbirds, butterflies? They fled into
Hummingbirds.
hummingbirds, right?
They just don't stay.
He was not of that sort. Anyway, he and Emil Rudik did a study. They collaborated, Rudik from Russia, collaborated on a study comparing the performance of cooperatives against comparable private enterprises and state enterprises in relation to some 15 different variables, 15 different criteria, which, though most of them dealt with economic indicators, they also spanned the realm of the impacts of these enterprises on communities, on the environment, on social cohesion, and other kinds of variables like this. And they found that cooperatives outperformed state-run enterprises of a command economy on every criteria. They outperformed private enterprises on all criteria but two, one of which they were tied with, and only one of which that they ended up being a bit inferior in relation to, and that was the efficiency of allocation of capital. In private enterprise, you have all these venture capitalists out there who have a lot of money and to move around quite quickly to promote new technologies. And Vanek took that as a challenge, and he worked out a system whereby cooperatives organized much in the way that Carl described into meta groupings would be able to concentrate capital and move it around in a way such that they could outperform capitalist enterprises in that particular respect as well. So cooperatives are, if they have a proper environment, very problematic as Carl described. If they have a proper environment, if they're run properly, are a superior form of enterprise in many respects, and in respects that go far beyond their economic performance. Ian this morning was talking about, made reference to Owen and talking about the relationship that cooperatives bring between economy and society. And others touched upon it, and I'd like to just mention it as well, that there is a relationship as well between economy and governance. All of you are aware that right now it is the concentration of wealth that has almost corrupted, totally corrupted, the viability of democracy in America and in many other so-called democratic countries of the world. I would posit that private enterprise and democracy are inherently incompatible, much for the reason that David mentioned, that the nature of private enterprise is to grow in size. And they grow in size and power until they become humongous and have, as Ian was mentioning this morning, immense power. In some cases, power that rivals the power of the state, and certainly the power to influence the agenda of the state. If you are to have viable democracy, you must have democracy in the workplace. It will revolutionize the quality of democratic institutions in this country, should that change be made. And there are many other important things as well. But on to a couple of points that David brought up. David looked over Maheshwarananda's book, After Capitalism. It's been a long time since I've read that. I was a reviewer of that book. I was dissatisfied with it in certain respects. This, by the way, is my own book. It's a much heavier tome and much bigger book than I would take on to read, but I tried to make it browser-friendly. Prout is a relatively new and rapidly evolving theory. And there are many areas in which ideas are being tossed out there for consideration and come under critique and modification. And David brought up two areas in which I would tend to agree with David that that there is not a completeness in Maheshwarananda's book. He talked first of all about the matter of investment. How am I doing on time here, Alistair?
You've got it. 1 second here. Got 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. I'm going to have to adjust accordingly. I was invited to the Russian Far East by the People's Academy of Sciences to help them at a time when Russia was undergoing a dramatic transformation from a command economy to something else. And the Public Academy of Sciences had looked at the Prout model and were very interested in it. Its humanism, its democratic nature, its sustainability, features like this were quite compelling. And as a result, long story, but eventually the governor of one of the states there invited me and a colleague to put forward an economic development proposal. We had to then look quite concretely at this issue of the issues, really, of investment, how to mobilize investments, capitalize industries, and also how to transfer existing industry from state ownership, in this case, to cooperative ownership. In relation to the latter issue of transitioning ownership, the approach that we advocated was somewhat similar to what David has outlined. A kind of a controlled transitional strategy of the state turning over its enterprises to workers, worker management. When you get into the, on the field, on the ground, with the reality of these kinds of problems, there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of nuances that reality presents you with that you have to work through. And oftentimes, multiple solutions need to be taken. And I believe that's true as well with the issue of how do we capitalize cooperative ventures. David mentioned one form of capitalization. I tend to be a little skeptical of taking single approaches. There tends to be a lack of resiliency if you end up having problems with that particular approach. In Russia, we propose multiple approaches. Certainly the capitalist model would make use of some degree of centralized distribution of capital, for the exact reason that David brings up, that we need to think about global equity. We cannot just say that those areas of the world that happen to be very rich in resources, rich in capital, can go off on their own and leave other areas of the world that are very poor to fend for themselves. It's a bit problematic to take, in some respects, to take the particular approach that David says, where you just distribute wealth per capita. It is a, finish the sentence, it is better than an approach of pure localization, but better yet is an approach in which you can target investment so that it can be concentrated in those areas that have greater need for investment capital. Anyway, those are a couple of contributions to a beginning of a dialogue concerning issues that need much more discussion.
And we want to be mindful that you also are a part of that dialogue. I think it's very critical that time be allowed for you to put forth your own comments and questions. And I would like to ask the panel that instead of taking another speaker, since we only have maybe 6 minutes left, if we might take one question at this time, and maybe I'll be able to expound a little bit on one question and then come back and begin to wrap up. Yes, ma'am.
This is just a comment. I just recently returned from Nicaragua, and there is a cooperative in Nicaragua run by people, and they're investing and reinvesting their own money, and they are seemingly trying to get off the ground after a few years. But the problem that we've just run into is now that Nicaragua is under Ortega's government, the land now, the woman that owns the land wants it back, and she wants to throw the people off the land. So my question to you is that one of the considerations, is how do we afford cooperatives the ability to stay on the land that their businesses are? Or whichever way you want to say it. Thank you.
I mean, well, you may have more to say. I would just say off the top of my head, this question of land is a major question that I really don't talk about in my book. But I mean, it's one thing to talk about factories and setting up factories, but land is another issue. And clearly there has to be public, it seems to me, some kind of public ownership of land that can be long-term leases or whatever. But the land clearly is something that nobody created, no individuals. But you probably thought more about it.
Yeah, at the Fight for Economic Democracy panel this morning, my colleague Jason Schreiner began to address this question, and it's one that the Prout Institute in Oregon has looked at because we are trying to come forward with an economic relocalization plan with a focus on the agriculture and forestry sectors. So we've had to get into the Prout literature on how do you cooperatize, how do you bring land into cooperative management. And this whole issue of land redistribution has been one in which there has been a rich history of failures. It's been very problematic. And Prout has probably given as much thought to that as any aspect of its looking into transitioning into cooperatives. And we put forward, it's about a 12, 15-year stage-by-stage approach. It would take a little more time to get into than I think I have scope for here, or the audience would probably have interest in. But I will say it's a very significant issue, and it's one that really requires some deep thought for it to be viable.
I could comment. First of all, I'm just thrilled all this talking about cooperatives. But in terms of this particular issue, a very important element of the cooperative is that individuals benefit, right? But the collectivity benefits. And what has happened over the years, and because of inadequate consideration by lawyers, or if you want to get conspiratorial, maybe there's another explanation, that dimension of cooperatives has been downplayed until you have what you might call a liberal understanding of cooperatives. We are an agglomeration of individuals, right? Well, that's a part truth. The other part of it is there's the collectivity in common capital. And common capital is a big concern. You know, when the Europeans expanded, they sent the sailor, the soldier, the missionary, the politician, the businessman, and the surveyor, which was the most important. So the question for the cooperative studies, if you want to put it that way, is how to reassert the notion of commonality. When we redid the Cooperative Principles International, we did our best, but so deeply embedded was the notion of the liberal co-op that we could only go part way. But the notion of common ownership, which is not easy in our society, and not easy in yours, I don't think, to really get their minds around. Nor is the legal structure set up to support that, nor the financial system. When you have a common ownership, bankers get very nervous. Because who's going to be stuck with the bill if it all falls apart? You know, it's the common issue. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's a reluctance. And I know in terms of people starting, I'm getting long-winded. If starting co-ops and who want to try to build that in, they've had trouble finding a lawyer in my society, in my city, who can do that comfortably. And feel they're giving advice to their clients. I mean, to be fair to them. So that's, I mean, the common form becomes some form of land trust, which is a useful concept.
I don't think we have enough time for another question. I appreciate it, but why don't we go ahead and break now, and we'll meet back here at 1 o'clock. And complete this section, and we'll have the opportunity then to go for an entire hour afterwards. Here, after they've eaten. And we want to pick up with the last two panelists, and then we'll open the floor up for questions and responses from any of the speakers. Dr. Radhi Sins is a senior reader in commerce and management in the Gorakhpur University, India, and he specializes in information management and organizational behavior. He's worked on the faculty since 1986, and he's also associated with 2 open universities as academic counselor and assistant coordinator. He's going to talk about cooperatives in the emerging economic order.